sorry. I haven't like set it up for TikTok yet. And so I figured I'd run to the restroom really quick before I set it up for TikTok. So give me just a second. And actually, I'm going to take another hit before I start TikTok because TikTok doesn't appreciate that concept. I hope you're doing well today. I never know who it is, but I do know that there's somebody there. I have some ideas. I'm pretty sure we know each other in real life. I'm pretty sure. There we go. It wasn't working before then. Okay. We're going to start over on TikTok now. I need to make sure that I have all the things set up on TikTok really quick. That's good. That's good. Okay. I think I have it all set up. Let me go ahead and get it shared out for everybody. And then we'll go ahead and we'll just go down the list today because I'm using the list with Denny behind it. And going from there. Welcome as you guys come in onto TikTok. We are also over on YouTube as well. YouTube will be a little bit of me and probably a little bit of websites over on YouTube. So if you're trying to follow along with websites. Also, if you are working with, or if I have the comments turned off in here because it's a little bit too much in here. Speaking of, I should probably do a little bit of that maybe and see if that will actually up the feed. So if I have to have comments turned off over here, then I will have them turned on over on YouTube. So if you want to be able to talk, you can absolutely go over to YouTube and comment on YouTube. It just gives kind of a little bit of a buffer, right, from people who are just trolling instead of actually looking for information. And so it will keep this chat a little bit calmer if this chat gets a little bit nasty, because sometimes this chat can get a little bit nasty. YouTube, I'm so sorry. That camera over there just sucks ass. It really comes from the fact that like my other camera is no longer working, right? Good morning, Sapphire. And so YouTube, I look pretty blah on YouTube, but I kind of felt like it might feel like not being able to see me on YouTube isn't fun either if it's just websites, because I think that some people, the way I'm a very interactive facial expression person, as I'm making interactive facial expressions. And so I think for some people, it kind of gives them the ability to kind of see those interactive facial expressions. And I think for some people, it makes it easier. And I got to actually, this is, oh, wait a minute. Did it do it that way? Can I, without pausing? If I paused it, I'm sorry. Not for that one, not for that one, not for that one, not for that one. Nope. I'm sorry if that paused that. I tried something new that I haven't done before. I need to toss this over into Discord. So this is Denny. Denny was half Neanderthal and half Denisovan. That's why she's depicted like this. And Denny was about 13 when she died about 90,000 years ago. I'm sorry, it is Monday and they're going to be doing some yard work outside. So you're going to hear that a little bit. My YouTube is the Inwita Ord right there. Now, everybody, it's going to pause me for just 1 second. I need to ship this somewhere else really quick. I hate when I don't know what I'm doing. I hate when I don't know what I'm doing. 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 It's not working. And I can't do it that long. Sorry, that was just too much for me. I didn't even get it done because it was just too much for me and I couldn't figure out how to make it work. And yeah, so Denny is about 13 years old when she dies, about 90,000 years ago. And we know that biologically she is female. Biologically, there are three sexes, actually. There's male, female, and intersex. And intersex makes up roughly 2% of the population. To give you a visual aid with this, 2% of the population is redheads, and 2% of the population has green eyes. And 2% of the population is intersex. Not the same 2%. Yet there's 2% of the population who has all of these different amazing, wonderful things about being Homo sapiens about them. And so Denny died about 90,000 years ago. We found her in Denisovan Cave, which is where we found pretty much all of our Denisova so far, really. In fact, I can't think any we found outside of Denisova Cave. So far, all of our Denisova have been found inside Denisova Cave. And of the Denisova, we've only found probably, I think, last I saw is maybe 7 pieces. It might have gone up since then. And all of the ones that we had of Denisova last I saw could fit inside the palm of your hand, with the exception of a slightly longer piece of mandible, but everything else was very small. All of the bones in Denisova Cave are under 2 inches in length, really. Thank you, Soap. You too. Much love. Okay, awesome sauce. Early Homo sapiens, absolutely. Up until probably 5,000 years ago, the majority of any sapiens population is dark of skin. We don't see majority of population having lighter shades of skin until about 5,000 years ago. And I do want to state that we're talking about scales of shades. We're not talking about everybody is really, really dark or everybody is really, really light. We're talking about if there's a midway point, half are on this side and half are on this side, and the lighter scale, darker scale. So Homo sapiens, at least 5,000 years ago, the majority of the population is still really dark of skin. Good morning. I've been gone for a while, and I apologize. And we popped up and we popped back down, so I don't think I need to be making my little bid for peace in our room yet, because it is slightly smaller. I had to drive. I drove 19 miles each way to go take my child to visit people. And so we drove from Portland, Oregon to near Miami, Florida. And not Florida. Miami always makes me think Florida. And I just learned that it's pronounced Miami, not Miami, when it's in Oklahoma, but near Miami, Oklahoma. And then we drove back. And so it was a 29-hour drive. And my child is not old enough to be, well, they're old enough to be driving, but they don't drive yet. So I drove the entire way. They're a child still, but they don't drive yet. And so I drove both ways, and it was a lot. We're all sapiens. Every single one of us are Homo sapiens. We've debunked the idea of race existing. The idea that race, which is a colonial construct that categorizes us into separate areas and states that certain areas are smarter than other areas, certain categories are smarter. It's going to get really loud for just a second. So if it's hard to hear me, I apologize. I'm going to kind of give it a second to make sure it goes down while I try and say some of this stuff, which I will probably repeat in just a second, just to make sure it's heard. So the theory of race gets invented in the 1850s, 1860s. Now, it kind of starts a little bit before that, right? We start seeing this concept of different people being marked by God for some ancestors wrong in the Bible. Starting before that, and this kind of gives a justification to Europeans' behavior, to the horrors that committing across the globe, it gives a justification in their mind for that behavior, because if their Bible tells them that they can do it because these people are obviously marked by the Bible, right? So in the 1850s, maybe slightly before that, because that's roughly when we start to see the theory of evolution come into play, and the idea that the categorization of certain groups of people as being less than other groups of people needs to have a scientific basis instead of a deity basis comes into play during that period of time, right? And so when we see that the understanding that the Bible is not justification enough anymore, the Bible might not actually be fact, and God may not have created you 6,000 years ago. In the 1800s, we see Neanderthal discovered at the same time, right? And during this period of time, they create an idea of race as different groups of the planet are not as evolved as other groups of the planet, right? And by saying that they're not as evolved as other groups of a planet, they come up with this concept that your phenotype, what you look like on the outside to everybody else, has to do with your genotype, what genes are inside your body and what actually makes you up. And in that, they thought that not only is it like whether or not you're going to have heart problems, but they also think that it has to do with whether or not you can feel pain, whether or not you're going to be less or more intelligent, whether or not you're going to be good at sports, whether or not you're going to, I don't know what the Latin pheno is. I don't know exactly what pheno is in Latin. Appearing, seeming. It means it's about seeming, which is exactly what we're talking about, right? The phenotype, what you see, right? Equating your genotype, which it's not. So in their attempt to create an idea that your phenotype equals your destiny, right? Like your phenotype is who you are, and it dictates how smart you are, and it dictates how good you are at a job. We see that a lot with gender bias, right? As well. So you can see that it's not just in this, right? That they use this across the categories to justify their atrocities. Science today is a very new thing that seeks to ignore the indigenous science that have been on the planet the entire time. And science today is a very new thing because it's a Western process of thought that came about 1,000 years after they had lost their science, because they had science and then their God outlawed science. And so they lost all their science. And when they lost all their science, it became impossible for them to then actually learn new science without going back to the people before, the Greeks, or the Egyptians, or going across the globe to indigenous cultures in different spaces who have been able to maintain their science. So when science is getting started, and then concepts over into the theory of evolution, in its concepting over into the theory of evolution, it's working very hard to justify its atrocities, or justify the atrocities of European men. And it's also working very hard to justify the continued space on top that, all white guys think they're entitled to, right? It's working very hard to justify that concept that if you are rich and white, then you are exactly what's supposed to happen, right? And so when they create theory of race as a categorization of people based on that phenotype. Now, I'm going to tell you that the theory of race has been debunked 100%. And we did that because the theory of race was created using, calipers are about as scientific measurement as you get within the theory of race and its creation. Okay. The theory of race uses things like paint swatches and compares your skin color and your eye color to paint swatches. It uses things like a pencil test to see if a pencil will fall out of your hair or stay in your hair naturally. It uses calipers to measure, but what it uses calipers to measure is skeletal measurements, which is called chronology or phrenology, and these are debunked pseudosciences. We know that, I mean, I'm so mixed that anything you see on me probably came from some ancestor somewhere, right? Yet you look at me and you can put my face on anybody of any skin tone and you're going to think that it's somebody from that, right? I see people, I have family members who look just like me who are darker. I have family members who look just like me who are lighter. And you can see, like, whether or not my lips are thick or my nose is sharp and pointy, or, you know, I have an angled jaw, does not indicate where I come from as my ancestry, right? That's just not how genes work. It's just not how alleles mix. We wanted to think that that's how alleles mix, but it's just not. And so they're using these very artistic kind of tools to try and measure a scientific fact. And in doing so, again, it's really doubling down what they want it to mean. It's really doubling down on their concept of themselves, their concept of maintaining their superiority in their own brain and maintaining their superiority on a social structure. Many people will say that this is a social concept. I disagree. I believe it is a colonial construct in its best wording because of the fact that this is something that comes from colonialism. Some genetic traits and specific traits do come through being genetically isolated, but that almost comes from so if you and I have the same gene and we have a baby together and that gene meets, right? This happens a lot of times if you're siblings or something like that. This is typically inbreeding, but this can happen in non-inbreeding situations, right? That gene meets, if that gene meets enough times, it starts to mutate. If it's one-on-one enough times, it kind of starts to mutate. This is where with inbreeding, we get the Habsburg jaw. We get insanity and things like that. If a gene one-on-one meets enough times, it starts to mutate, right? The same gene, right? Because it needs some genetic differences. It needs a little bit of pop, right? And so in a culture that is isolated, you might see specific genes really coming to play, but it's very rarely genes that, it's never intelligence genes. Like we're talking about, there are people who can hold their breath for 35 minutes underwater and deep sea dive without help of any bags or anything else, right? Like a scuba gear or anything like that, right? There are people around this world. And so some of those, they're usually water spaces, obviously, because they're diving in deep sea, right? Some of those indigenous communities that have that capability, or communities that would no longer be considered indigenous, like there are communities in Korea like that. Some of those communities have that not only from the fact that those communities were isolated and practiced this need of adaptation for an extended period of time, the need of the same adaptation for the extended period of time, but they also have Denisovan DNA, and Denisovan DNA has been proven to also be something that we see helps people in low oxygenation environments like Tibet or high up in the mountains. So Denisovan DNA has a gene for less rich oxygen environments, so for low oxygenation. And I'm sorry, those are a lot of big words and hard for me to like place all together sometimes. And so there is concept that some of these, and most of the people who are deep sea divers are people who have Denisova DNA in them, because where we see Denisova DNA, right? Yeah, right. So, and it has to do with there's a gene that helps with oxygenation for Denisova. And again, she is half Denisovan. So with the concept of race gets debunked when we start using real science, like science that has weight and evidence outside of our perceptions, right? Like not about what we want it to be, but about what it's supposed to be, not using our confirmation bias. They do something called the Whole Genome Project. And the Whole Genome Project is scientists from around the world, from many different communities, from indigenous communities, from African communities, from Asian communities, who are coming together, and they're doing whole genome DNA testing on people. This paused. I'll be right back. I apologize. TikTok has been doing that with my lives lately. If it pauses like that, I will be right back. I promise. If I'm going to leave, I will tell you I'm going to leave if I need to pause it for a reason. If it pauses like that, it's because TikTok is pausing my lives. I'll start it right back. I'll come back as soon as possible. And again, I am over on YouTube as well if you're trying to follow along and stuff cuts out. When we start looking at the whole genome project, I don't know exactly when it cuts out, so let me double check. The whole genome project starts when scientists from around the world start looking at the whole of the genome, the entirety of your DNA and my DNA. So they take my DNA and they look at the whole of my DNA, right? And they put together all the genes. Well, they do it to me and they do it to thousands of other people. And when they do that, they start comparing to see which genes are similar, which genes are the same, things like that. And in doing that, they realize that, first of all, the Khoi population of South Africa, Khosian, is pronounced in a way that is considered a slur. So if you cannot use the clicks within language, then it is preferred that you use the term Khoi. So the Khoi population of South Africa has all the genomes of every sapiens out there. Like every sapien gene that you can find across the planet is within the Khoi population of South Africa. And you can see a range of different alleles within the Khoi population. Alleles affect things like your phenotype, the color or complexity of your skin, like the way your skin patterns out, because our skin patterns out, and like the way that your skin interacts, like acne and things like that. And it also, phenotype also is like your hair and your eyes and things like that. So they have all the alleles that affect phenotypes. They have all of it within the Khoi population of South Africa. Now, that does not mean that the Khoi population of South Africa is the ancestors of all of us. That is not what I'm saying for the comment within there. It is that. So let's really quickly touch on the new information on how we speciate as a species. Homo sapiens speciates starting at 300,000 years ago, and how we speciate starting at 300,000 years ago is what we call speciation through convergence. This means that many different species of Homo being the genus that we all belong to, many different species underneath the genus Homo are intermixing, they're breeding, right? And they're living in bands. Band as opposed to tribe, really quick. Tribe means a community based on genetic lineage, and band is a community based on not genetic lineage, but need. So many different bands of early genus Homos are all together in these bands, and they're intermixing and they're interbreeding. And this creates our first Homo sapien in Morocco at 300,000 years ago. And then there's a couple more, at least that we can find in the archaeological record, right? And then there's a couple more Homo sapiens that we see at 260,000 years ago in Ethiopia and in South Africa, both around the same time. Now, of course, this is just what we see. That doesn't mean that that's the only one. There's probably at least 10,000 at this point because we're seeing at least one, right? So when we're seeing that, they don't solidify into a singular species of their own until 125 to 135,000 years ago. Now, at this point, some of them are already up in Iraq. Some of them are already on the Arabian Peninsula, which is still kind of connected to Africa a lot more than it is today. So at this time of solidification of the entire Homo sapiens species, we're seeing that the population is all moving about. Now, we have within our genetics across the planet 2 species that we found in the fossil record, Denisovan and Neanderthal, and about 6 ghost species. These are genes we don't know where they came from. They're obviously terrestrial. They're obviously from genus Homo, but we don't see them in our species other than in specific spaces, and we don't see them in other spaces, right? So within the Khoi population that does not have Neanderthal DNA, one of the only two populations on the planet that do not have Neanderthal DNA, the Kwe and the Yoruba. Of the Kwe population, they have all the genes for sapiens. They also have 3 ghost species. So there's genes within them that we do not see in other Homo sapiens, which also indicates that they're not our ancestor population. What it means is that as other Homo sapiens are kind of moving about and interacting and stuff like that, and interacting back and then coming up, and we're constantly moving as a species, just like many other Homo species. As part of what being human means is curiosity. It's going, it's learning, it's finding new things. Not quite. Cro-Magnon is one skull, and that's his name, and it's 30,000 years ago, and we were actually here before then. So when we're seeing that intermixing and that moving around, the Kwe population is solidifying, right? Because the Kwe population solidifies roughly 70,000 years ago. At the same time, we see that the start of the continual population in Australia, which is the oldest continual population outside of Africa, is starting, right? So the Kwe is the oldest continued population on the planet. The Australians are the next oldest continued population because they're roughly around the same time. So we see all of this, all of the human genome within the Kwe species, all of the species Homo sapiens genome within the Kwe population, which I was not trying to refer to as species. Please forgive that turn of phrase because it came out wrong. So when we see this, not only do we see the entirety of the human genome within the Kwe population, we also see within the Kwe population, we also see that if you are a member of the continued population that has been in Iraq for 150,000 years, because we've been there that long, if you're part of the continued population who's been in Iraq for generation upon generation, though the current continuation, I think, is like 40,000 years ago. So if you're part of that population, you're going to be more genetically different from your next door neighbor who's been a part of that continued population than you are from somebody in a different continued population. Call these primary populations. So primary population in Sweden and a primary population in Iraq. The primary population in Iraq is going to have more genetic diversity within it than they are going to have between them and Sweden. You'll be more genetically different from your next door neighbor than you will with somebody in an entirely different primary population. And I'm going to use some really small numbers for my ease to describe this. If we have 100 genes as the human species, and everybody gets 25 genes, and you have genes 1 through 25, and your next door neighbor who's been in the family's been there for ages, they've owned that farm for generation upon generation, your next door neighbor has genes 75 through 100. You have completely opposite genes of your next door neighbor. Somebody in Sweden also has genes 1 through 25, and somebody in Sweden also has genes 75 through 100, right? So you have more genetic difference from your next door neighbor than you do from somebody in an entirely different population, right? Primary population again. And we see the entirety of the human genome within the Kwe population of South Africa. These two things debunk the theory of race, because the theory of race states that your phenotype indicates what your genotype is. It states that the color of your skin and the color of your hair and the color of your eyes is your ancestry, is who you are, is dictates your intelligence, dictates your pain, dictates your rights, dictates all of these other things. So in debunking the theory of race, and again, the theory of race being created in the 1850s by the people who are working with the theory of evolution, these early scientists, this is actually the field of anthropology, which I'm a member of, that creates the theory of race. The field of anthropology, again, that I'm a member of, is working very hard to debunk the theory of race right now, and they are who helped create the whole genome project and who brought together the understanding that race does not exist. Currently, today, we're also finding out things like whether or not a person who is Black in America has heart problems has way more to do with redlining than grandpa. Whether or not a person is diabetic in America has way more to do with whether or not they grew up on a reservation than whether or not they're Native American or European American, right? Because of the fact that the way that we redline, the way that we confine, the way that we have concentration camps in the United States actually creates these problems within people. And it is not about their genetics. It is about the problem created by the environment, the problem created by the situation, the problem created by the space in which they're put into, right? Which is really important when we look at the fact that medical racism is still extremely prevalent across the globe. And as long as medical racism is extremely prevalent across the globe and believes things like phenotype indicates genotype, then we will maintain our number one position as the highest rates of maternal mortality within the industrialized world, primarily among Black and brown women. So we need to take a look at the racism within the structure and the racism within science that dictates these things and causes the ignorance and sometimes willful ignorance that causes the problems that is causing the extended period of this trauma. I'm not sure with any thoughts on the hunter-gatherer brain versus farming brain theory of autism and ADHD. So recently, they're actually stating that they think autism comes from Neanderthals. I personally, as a neurodivergent, and before I knew I was neurodivergent, have always thought that this is actually a evolutionary advantage, an evolutionary adaptation. So if you are in a world where, so first of all, more people are neurodivergent than people are neurotypical. We have more neurodivergent people than we do neurotypical people. What is typical rated on? Typical is rated on some Western concept of what the brain should be doing based on 10,000 years of indoctrination to create control. So the neurotypical brain, again, the smaller percentage of the population, is based on somebody else's concept of what typical is. Then if we look at the fact that throughout our known history, we see that anytime we find somebody who creates an invention, creates a great step forward, anytime we see a couple of people interacting that do these giant leaps in technology or understanding, they have traits that we associate with people who are autistic or neurodivergent. It's long been understood that Einstein was most likely autistic. Not only that, but it was his wife who wrote most of his first theories. So it's long been understood that many of these greatest minds throughout history are neurodivergent in our understanding today of what neurodivergent is. All that aside, I think that if we have a higher prevalence of things like autism and neurodivergence in our population today, that it has to do with advancing our brains. We live in a space and a time when I can talk to you in Wales or Africa or China or India in a second. You can hear, as I'm speaking these words, you can hear. We live in a time when everything is coming at us like this. And so for our brain to decide to adapt, to catch up, is a very, 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 anybody who understands evolving through adaptation or understands how the brain works or understands really anything will tell you that when we're adapting to meet our surroundings. They're doing studies today that talk about how modern society is adapting our brain and adapting our body. And that to me is why we see so many people that we, and again, I think that there's always been more people who are neurodivergent and autistic, or just neurodivergent, because autism really falls within that, right? More people who are neurodivergent across society than there have been people who would be considered neurotypical. We just talk about them as those that aren't perfect. They just don't fit. Society is built on its outsiders. Society is built on having an in and an out, right? It's been going on this whole time. We just ain't fucking talking about it. And 9 times out of 10, when we look at those who, Madame Curie, there's no way that person was not neurodivergent, right? When we're looking at these things, we absolutely can, if we look with an understanding of what neurotypical is, right? If we've done any sort of research, and then we look at any of the concepts that Marie Curie did or any of the life that she lived, we can see that. Same thing with Einstein, same thing with many other different people. And I'm saying that because if you look, don't just take my word. Don't just say, oh, Witta said it online, so it must be fucking true, because I'm not about that. Just because I say it, I mean, I could be wrong tomorrow. There's things I stated at the very start of this entire friggin' thing that were wrong in 6 months. And I had to come back and go, well, damn, that's not true anymore. Let's look at it this way instead, right? So don't just take my word for it. Go and look up what neurodivergent traits are, and then go and look up any of your famous inventors. Legitimately, any famous inventor. That's real bunny foo-foo, because of the fact that there is a lot of misunderstanding, again, because of racism within the medical system, right? Because of the fact that medical racism is really prevalent. And when we're looking at medical racism and the way that medical racism, well, when we look at racism and the way that racism treats children of color, of any color, like whether it's, Black or Indigenous, or even immigrant children who are darker skin, not Mexicans who are Indigenous, but like maybe from India or something like that, right? When we look at the way that the system treats any child who is darker of skin, we see that they treat every child who is darker of skin as being older than they are, right? Like they act like, well, you may be 9, but really you're 16, and I'm going to treat you like you're 16, right? And so medical racism does that as well. And so when it looks at concepts like, why are you acting this way, instead of looking at it as it's, might be neurodivergence, or it might be, something along this lines, or it might be a trauma response or epigenetics, we go, well, you're just being lazy, right? Which we do in a lot of different areas, but we do it way more when we're looking at children who are darker of skin. Mr. Martinez, so my website, inwittaord.com, compiles bibliographies. This does not mean they're my articles. It means they're other people's articles that I list as sources. And so if you want to go to my website, I don't do a whole lot on neurodivergence and autism. I was just asked about it. And there's a lot of new stuff coming out about Neanderthals and autism. And so, and that was just, it was my understanding of what I see. It was my concept and my thought process from an anthropological standpoint, which as an anthropologist, I'm allowed to do. Like, I'm allowed to take all the information that I've gathered and put it together into a concept, right? That's actually my job. We have paused over there, so give me 1 second and we'll be right back. It did decide right there to do it, right? So it's actually my job to conceptualize what all of these different things put together mean. That's kind of what an anthropologist or an archaeologist's job is to go, okay, so if I put all of these things together, then all of these things together mean this. And that's why we have anthropologists and scientists, and really anybody who's in a field of academia, is so that they can put a bunch of different concepts together and go, well, okay, I think that that's what that is, right? Yeah, well, and I am, like I was saying, I kind of was conceptualizing that before I realized that I was neurodivergent. I mean, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and I grew up backwoods and off-grid with boomer parents, and there was no concept of that, right? And I didn't even start looking at it until I was probably in my 40s, and I started seeing stuff on like Facebook and stuff, and I went, well, damn, that sounds like me. Maybe that's what it is. And then I had to go in and get diagnosed and stuff like that. But it's just, I was looking at it like that before. I was looking at it as an advancement before. Like I was like, maybe I was looking at it as an advancement in our brain beforehand, and then after I realized that it was me, it couldn't be an advancement. It's just me, right? So, that's when I kind of started looking at the concept that really we have more divergent than typical, right? And then when you start to see what all when you know what neurodivergence presents like, then you can see if you read any form of history and you like reading about inventors or people who came up with concepts and things like that, it's just really, I love history. That's, where one of my first loves, history and anthropology or archaeology were like my first big things that I was really into. But I was also raised very ancestral centered. And so for me, it was a way to connect as well. And so I've always read history and anthropology books. I started reading in archaeology books at like 5 in TP. That's how I learned. But in that concept and that thought process and that molding through, like I've been reading about kings and queens, but I've also been reading about great warriors, and I've also been reading about great inventors, anything that has a historical bent, that is in enough of a novel form that it's not dry, right? Like I'm going to read that. And so I've read of numerous different inventors across time. And then after I started looking at neurodivergence, and I went, just like after I started looking at narcissism, I went through all the kings that I had read of and went, now I know where that comes from too, right? So and then if you look recently, so they have a study that they came out with that I have not put on the website yet, but it's in my saves to put up there, where they linked depression with a disease that happens about 9,000 years ago, with a pandemic that happens about 9,000 years ago. And that pandemic, they believe, starts the mutation of the genetics or the genes to create the depression chemical response. Now, I haven't read too deep in it, and I haven't dived too deep, yet it does fit along other things that I've conceptualized and understood, right? Yeah, medical racism has nothing to do with money. It really is because there's a lot of doctors who think that if you're Black, you don't feel pain. And there's a lot of doctors who think that if you're Native, you're a drunk. And so you will have Indigenous women who go into hospitals. They stopped forced sterilizing people legally in 1978, the year I was born. And yet I know women my age who were not allowed to leave the hospital with their baby unless they had a tubal ligation that they did not want, or unless they had a hysterectomy that they did not want. That is forced sterilization. Right. And they do this specifically with Indigenous women because of the fact that they relate it to thinking that anybody who is Indigenous is obviously prone to alcoholism. Right. And we see that the reason that the maternal mortality rate is so high, and what I mean by maternal mortality rate is the women who die in pregnancy and childbirth across this country. And we are number 1 of the industrialized nations for maternal mortality rate. And it is absolutely among Black and Indigenous women that makes up this number. Right. So when we look at that, it ranges as to why this happens, and why this happens. The ranges of why it happens is they ignore pain because they think that Black women don't feel pain the way that white women feel pain. So if a Black woman says that her pain level is at 7, so obviously there's something really wrong here, they decide that she must be exaggerating for drug seeking because Black women don't feel pain, which is why the father of gynecology used Black slaves to perform, trigger warning because this is very violent, hysterectomies on women that he did not put under before he did it. Because medical racism states that Black women don't feel pain in the way that white women feel pain. And so today, a Black woman will go, this is high, this is bad, there's something fucking wrong, please hear me. And the doctors will go, there's nothing wrong with you, you're just exaggerating the pain. And they do that no matter what your skin color is. They just do it worse with Black women. So don't tell me they don't do it, because having done 3 births, they absolutely tell you that shit, right? They absolutely tell you that you don't really feel the pain that you do. So, and it's absolutely that, Skooma. Like, that's absolutely what it is, right? So I don't know what you think you're saying, Mike. I'm sorry, but I've not seen anything along those lines, and it's not the number one fact of DNA. Specifically, not the number one fact of DNA that I know of, right? Like, that's just not it. Yeah, like there are doctors who, very often, paleontologist is the study of animal remains, not human remains. So I'm paleoanthropologist. Okay, Mike, I think that you're done in this chat. You're not. So what study are you talking about that states that Africans are unique because they have 9 strands of DNA that nobody else has 9 strands of DNA? I mean, first of all, I'm pretty sure that there's a lot more strands of DNA. Pretty sure. I mean, like, DNA is not my specialty, right? The only DNA research of DNA on DNA. Do you know what DNA means? Do you know that there's like multiple researches of DNA? Like, the only DNA out there is African DNA, is what you're saying? I mean, I'm sorry, but you're not. Listen, trying to separate people out as species, or trying to separate people out from their DNA, or trying to create reasons for us to all be different only helps the governments in control keep everybody under their power. We are working on debunking, categorizing humans into different races, taking it into a different step, like deciding that specific races are superior to other races, and just flipping the script of that doesn't change the horrors that we're all enduring. It just gives us all another reason to fight each other and to hate each other, and maintains the power and control of the system and the structure that uses what we call othering, which is exactly what we're talking about, that hating each other, to keep us under control. Because if you hate your neighbor, if you hate me because you think I'm white, then you're not going to hear me because you think I'm white. And you won't understand that it's not me trying to hurt you, it's the government, and I'm trying to tell you, right? Like, if you're just, and I'm not, like, you just think I'm white because that's what the phenotype is, but I'm not. I never have been. That's not who I am. It's not how I grew up. It's not what my family is, right? This is presenting, right? But if you hate me, I mean, my direct maternal line ends in a woman named Lucy, who escaped with her daughter, my grandmother, in her belly, and her son on her hip from her master, who had raped her to create the baby in her belly. That's where my direct maternal line ends. So, it just doesn't work like that. And when you continuously make it about that, and make it about hating each other and about taking on each other and harming each other, then what you make it about is keeping those trying to kill you in charge. We live in a time when you can't eat, where you can't put a roof over your head, where your only value is what somebody can exploit. You don't like my presentability? People are trying to exploit you for everything you have, and when you're no longer exploitable, you become the houseless. And then they hate on you for not being exploitable. So instead of contributing to the exploitation of maintaining this structural racist system, that's why you can put yourself on top. I fully 100%, absolutely. But when you make it about division, me versus you, what you do is you maintain the power of the system. And the power of the system is what's grinding you, not me. I like to think of it as melanin per inch, right? Because really, we all have melanin, and what it is the alleles in the alleles in the baby, while they're in utero, will adjust based on the sun in the environment that the mother is in. So every baby is born a shade or two lighter or darker than their mother, depending on the sun environment that the mom is in while she's pregnant. And what it is this is this adaptation that we have, this fantastic, beautiful phenomenon that we have that is given us the ability to be across the entire planet. Without this ability to adapt, as well as the ability to adapt our eye color, without these abilities to adapt the way that the melanin condenses in our skin, melanin per inch of our skin, without those, we can't make it across the planet. We get light eyes before we get light skin. And this is because light eyes help you see in a low light environment. And so if you're in a dappled forest, that dappled forest is going to need lighter shades of eyes, less melanin per square inch so that it allows more light in so that you can see better. And in a heavy sun environment, you need more melanin per square inch in your eyes so that less light gets in so that you don't get overtaken by the light and get headaches and have problems, right? And the same thing with our skin tone. If we need the protection from the sun, we have more melanin per square inch. If we need less protection from the sun, we have less melanin per square inch, right? These things are really about how adaptable you as a species are, how adaptable your species is, how amazing we are, and what gets us from that point of start to this point of across the globe. And we get this from Homo erectus. Homo erectus gives us the adaptability. Hi, Grouch. Homo erectus gives us the adaptability of our eye color and our skin color. We see that the alleles for light skin, that adaptation actually start about 900,000 years ago. And those alleles really kind of start in the descendant of Homo erectus called Homo heidelbergensis, because they speciate in a lower sun environment. And so they don't need as much protection from the sun, right? So melanin per square inch is my newest thought process on it, just because of the fact that really it's about how much melanin is condensed per square inch or in your eye per square millimeters, and it really has to do with the adaptability of us as a species, and the fact we have this thing called expedient bipedalism, where we can stand upright and walk long distances. And this ability to stand upright and walk long distances while using tools, right? Being able to hunt, wear clothes and stuff with this, along with the ability of our body to adapt. It takes about 100 generations for an adaptation to fully take effect, or at least a step take effect. I mean, it's not always full from our perception at this timeline, right? Well, it takes that amount of time for an adaptation to take effect. That's about 2,500 years, because currently generations for Homo sapiens are 25 years, right? So these adaptations, as they take effect, as we're moving across the globe into different spaces, these adaptations are really about how we can live better in environments. And the one that we all look at the most is the last adaptation that ever affects us, because it's the least mattering of all the adaptations. It's literally matters the least of all the adaptations, and it's the one that we've decided is the most important and dictates every concept of us. Right? Like it's about everything we are and everything we do. And it is literally the one that physiologically matters the least, because the lack of vitamin D is not the real reason for the lightening of the skin, because we see that the eyes lighten before that. There are so many other things that we need to adapt before we need to get vitamin D from the sun, right? Because we can get vitamin D from plants. We can get vitamin D from other things across the planet. The picture is of Denny, who is half Neanderthal and half Denisovan. And she's about 90,000 years ago. And she was 13 years old when she died. She had a Denisovan father and a Neanderthal mother. It does, yet there are other ways to get it, is what I'm saying, Chris. Not that it's not something that's necessity, but that we can get it from many other things, which is why it was the last adaptation that we got. So Cheddarman is 10,000. I won't pronounce the H in Neanderthal. It's actually Neanderthal. Do you know why? Because Neander is the valley and tal means valley. So it's Neanderthal is where the first Neanderthal tall was found. I do say it sometimes because I grew up pronouncing an H in it like everybody else. I also find English to be a bastardized language made up of 10 different languages, and nobody in the United States speaks or pronounces any of it correctly or does any correct spelling or any correct grammar. So I don't worry about pronouncing things in American English because American English don't know how to pronounce anything anyways. There's no evidence of rickets being that big of an issue in our paleoanthropological skeletons. So Cheddarman is 10,000 years old, and Cheddarman is from England. Cheddarman's direct descendant is less than a mile from him, 300 generations down, right? Cheddarman has bright blue eyes and what is described as sub-Saharan alleles, so ultra dark skin, right? And this is 10,000 years ago. Otzi at 5,000 years ago, right? I think Otzi, I can't, sometimes it's hard for me to do numbers. So let me double check Otzi's date. So 5,000 years ago, I had it. Otzi at 5,000 years ago is what we would call brown today. So the categorization for those living in North Africa and those living in the Levant and on the Arabian Peninsula, the categorization of that on the debunked theory of race that we were talking about earlier is actually Caucasian. If you do not know, Caucasian means brown people, not white people. So it is thought that Otzi, or the alleles for Otzi's skin are shown to be we have paused again, we have paused again, we have paused again, we have paused again. We have paused again, we have paused again, we have paused again, we have paused again. I apologize. TikTok hates me some days. TikTok hates me a lot these days, actually. It does this all the time these days. So the alleles for Otzi show that Otzi was what we would call brown today, right? Middle Eastern in his skin tone is what they actually define it as. And this is 5,000 years ago, so 3000 BCE. And this is in the Swiss Alps. And his descendants are Swedish and Turkish. So when we look at that, what we can see is that the variation, the alleles, the adaptation for lighter skin is the last adaptation that we have, right? And this last adaptation that we have very much is not, it is about where the sun is at. It is about the sun, right? But it is not because we had to get light because vitamin D said we had to get light, because it is something that doesn't happen even in the sagas. Egil Skallagrimsson is dark. If you actually read the sagas, Egil Skallagrimsson is dark, and he is not the only person who is dark in the sagas. There is at least in every saga a Vikingar who is dark of skin, and I've read almost every single saga. Okay, of the Icelandic sagas. There are sagas that are Swedish that I've not read all of, just some of, right? Almost every single saga has somebody described as being dark, right? So even at 1,000 years ago, we see that in Scandinavia, there are a lot of people who are darker of skin, enough that they are mentioned in every single saga. Okay, so when we are looking at this, we understand that the lighter skin adaptation, well, it does have stuff to do with the sun. And well, we do definitely get more vitamin D when we have lighter skin, right? It is not that imperative to our biology, right? It is not that imperative to our livability, because we can get those things from other spaces across the environment, right? We can get vitamin D from different plants. We are led to believe that, D. We're also led to believe that, Egil Skallagrimsson is considered dark because and the reason it's stated that he is darker, and it does state that he's darker, because he is the son of the sister of, and I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Trollbjorn. And the reason he's Trollbjorn is because his mother was Sami. And at the time that the Icelandic sagas are being written down, not when they're created, but when they're being written down, Christianity, Snorri is very Christian, right? Hold on a second. I'll be right back, YouTube. Snorri is very Christian. And at the time that the sagas are being written down, hold on, I want to make sure because I'm not cooking, but somebody else is, and they're sleeping, so I want to make sure that their cooking is going right. So in the sagas, when Snorri wrote them down, Snorri is Christian, and Snorri is writing them down utilizing the current, at the time, Scandinavian need to marginalize and colonize the Sami. And so he writes down, every time you see the word troll in the sagas, they're talking about the Sami people or the Finn people, who are not the same. They're different groups. So when we're seeing that, what we're seeing is that when he says Trollbjorn, or when he says it's the sister of this person, somebody, it's either half troll or Trollbjorn. I think both of those are actually in the first paragraph, and I don't have my books right now. They're in the storage unit because we had some moving around to do, so I can't pull out the sagas right now. But in the first paragraph, I think it states both, that it's he is half troll and his mother is Trollbjorn or something along those lines. Not Egil, but the brother, the uncle, right? And in that, it states that he was darker because he was troll-born. And when you look at the Sami are actually lighter skin, right? And when we look at the way the two groups come into the region through archaeology and through the DNA that they've gotten from the region and stuff like that, we can see that two groups arrive in the region at the same time. One community comes from the Mediterranean area up through Europe, and like they're in lower Europe and they come up. And then the other is a Finno-Ugric speaking group that comes across the Arctic regions and down in. And the Finno-Ugric speaking group is the Sami. They are, as they move in, lighter of skin and darker of eye. And the modern day Swedes, modern day Scandinavians, Nords, Dutch are darker of skin and light of eye as they come up. And when we look at today, many of the Sami that we see are light of skin, or many of the Sami that I've interacted with on here, or many of the Sami that I know in my real life, outside of this, are lighter of skin. We do see, and I've been told many times that they're actually very light for Sami themselves, that Sami range in skin tones like anyone else, and that Sami can be really dark. And so we also see this. There's a, I want to say it's a Nordic museum that talks about a king and his wife, and the wife was Finn, and she was very dark, and in that conversation within there. And so we see that the documentation, and then we see within the genetics that the idea of everybody being Northern European white in Scandinavia is, not the idea, but the presence of everybody being Northern European white in Scandinavia is relatively new, right? Again, you're seeing with alleles of people that darker of skin is maintaining within the archaeological record at 5,000 years ago is when you start to see a shift where you're seeing more of the population being lighter than our darker. And again, lighter and darker are two scales. When I'm talking lighter and darker, I'm not talking the far end of dark black as black with that beautiful, like purple undertone that's just so dark that it's like almost like night. It's just dark, dark, beautiful, dark, or that very, very white that's almost translucent, right? I'm not talking about those. I'm talking if you have a middle point, one side and the other, right? This is the least important. Blue eyes are older than 5,000 years old. This is the least important of our adaptations. This is the least important of the things about us, and it is what we make the most of today. It's absolutely what we make the most of today. There's concepts that redheads are in Neanderthals as well, and that might be where we get the alleles for red hair, but we see red hair. We see alleles for red hair within the Quay population that doesn't have Neanderthal within them. And so I don't think that the allele that we only have alleles from Neanderthal. I think that we have alleles from both sides. So like you can get dark skin and light skin alleles from Neanderthals. If I look at my genetics, I actually have the dark skin allele for Neanderthals. And then I have a lighter skin allele for Homo sapiens. And so you can actually get darker or lighter skin alleles from Neanderthals, just like, oh, it's not doing. It wants me to verify because it says that I'm inactive. Hold on a second. You're inactive, really? I had not noticed. Let me throw it out there a little bit more. Maybe I was. You can fact check everything. Again, nwitaord.com is the website where I compile sources for the vast majority of my stuff. Like, I'm not going to say everything's on there because like this is 40 years of information I'm throwing at you, and some of it's new and some of it's old, and but there is quite a bit of the stuff. And then you can go and Google the rest of it if you want to or whatever. But there are links in my profile to that. Yeah, like it just, well, and it's been popping up and down. Nwita Ord. So the YouTube up there where it says Nwita Ord, that's my everything. You can find me at Nwita Ord everywhere. It's nwitaord.com for the website. And if you go to my profile, there is a link in the profile, so you don't even have to type it in to try and find it. Right. So I don't really study where alleles for things come from, right? And they're like DNA. Some things have numbers and letters to make up the entire word. And when you have numbers and letters to make up an entire word, I don't understand the language of that word, and my brain does not compute it. So while I can give you base information on DNA as it applies to other things that I know that I put a lot of time and effort into studying and understanding, and the DNA stuff kind of correlates and validates and solidifies it for people, I don't study DNA and I don't study the alleles and things like that because of the fact that for me, it just doesn't compute right in my brain. Math is a language I don't understand as well. So you'll see that dates are something that I always try and double check. And I'll tell you, well, I think it's this, but if I'm off by a little bit, please forgive me on it because it's not intentional. And geography, I don't do geography very well. I have specific spaces that I know caves are, right? Like I can tell you that there is a cave in France that has our oldest tattooing instrument in it, right? And our oldest tattooing instrument is 35,000 years old. And it is literally a flake that they thought was a discard flake that has a point, a singular point on it. And on that singular point, they found residue from pigment and they found blood. And so this is how we know this is our oldest tattooing tool, right? I can tell you that, and I can tell you it's in France, but I can't tell you, am I talking southern France, northern France, eastern France, western France? I know that the cave name is La M something, right? And I know that I can find it if I need to, right? Like I know if I go and Google it, I can find the cave, and I know that that's cave, right? But I can't like give you like the geography of it, right? Just because it's like not my thing. And it's not that like what it is like, I mean, because I'm a radiographer before I was an archaeologist. And so it's not that I haven't taken physics courses. It's not that I haven't done those kinds of things. It's that my brain doesn't read that language. I know Svenska. I can speak to you in a couple of other actual languages, but I can't speak to you in maths, It is good. I love that one. That's actually 27,000 years ago. And what it is actually a pattern guy, like somebody who worked with patterns and statistics, I think, was doing a walkthrough in a cave. And he was like, oh, that's a pattern and that's statistic, like that's numbers, like that's a marking of something, right? And that's where they distinguish that there's writing. And that to me makes perfect sense. One thing that I've been talking to my son about and a few other people about a lot lately that many people don't know is that we like to date cuneiform as our earliest form of writing, but it's really just that cuneiform is our first alphabet. Now, an alphabet is a specific number of characters that only signify syllables. Hieroglyphics and pictographics are characters that symbolize either a syllable or a whole word. And there's an extra character or mark near them that tells you what to think that is, right? So like hieroglyphics, you'll see a cartouche around 3 symbols turns those words into syllables, right? And that's a king's name. So hieroglyphics predate cuneiform by like 1,000 years. So when we talk about our earliest forms of writing being cuneiform, what we're talking about is the first thing that Western concept wants to attribute as writing is the alphabet within cuneiform, right? But we have, we do. We have petroglyphs here in Turtle Island and in Abya. We have a lot of carvings here in Turtle Island and Abya. We also have a lot of people don't understand that within Turtle Island and Abya, we actually have several different writing systems. And you probably know of them if you think. Like the Dakota people had and there are 3 groups within the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, right? The Dakota people had a buffalo hide that was a calendar. And it actually showed different years for the last couple of 100 years, period. And it was significant events in different years for the last couple 100-year periods, right? The Mayan calendar, the Mayan hieroglyphics is something that pretty much everybody knows of, but we kind of disregard, right? And then the Constitution is based on the constitution of what we would call the Iroquois. These are the 5 confederated tribes. They have 5 names, right? The Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe. There's I butcher names sometimes, and so I try not to say all of them right because some of them I will butcher way too much. And they had a constitution that was written in wampum, right? This is something that you may have seen come across the news within the last few years when it was actually returned to the 5 confederated tribes, right? There is writing many, many spaces within Turtle Island, which is North America, and Abya, which is South America. And yet we tend to think of them as having never written down in all of these spaces. Yes, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful story, and it's a beautiful piece of writing. It's a beautiful piece of information, right? Another thing that we see here in Turtle Island and Abya that a lot of people don't credit is metallurgy. There is metalwork that was done in Turtle Island and Abya well before Europeans invaded, right? Well before Europeans started their colonization. There's metalwork in North and South America, right? With gold and even with silver, right? There is a lot of, and there is pottery here as well. And that's another one that they don't like to attribute to Turtle Island and Abayali and indigenous people. There's also pottery here as well, right? Dental work. There's evidence of trepanation, which trepanation is brain surgery, right? So there's evidence of trepanation. There's a lot of advanced knowledge here that just gets completely, and the advanced medicine is the one that always gets me. Like the extensive medicine here was so good that disease concepts weren't really here. Like there wasn't a lot of, like you didn't have a common cold or a flu, right? This also has to do with city building here because there are vast cities that were built here, but the vast cities that were built here, as opposed to the vast cities based on Western monocrop agriculture, the vast cities here were built in a way that were not only ecologically sound for the environment that they were built in, but the word is not working for my brain right now, but sanitate. had sanitation. There was the ability to not have feces floating through the streets, unlike Europe, right? There's a lot of advancements that were here within city planning and city building, and this has to do with the concept of belonging to instead of owning, right? And it has just paused out of me, so I'll be right back. I'm here. I apologize. I'm here and I'm queer, and all of the good things that go with being here and queer. So the city planning that was here was extremely advanced compared to city planning across the rest of the globe. It is. I have a lot of. It keeps bumping me down and stuff like that, and so I'll have to come back and open it right back up and stuff like that. It's been really giving me problems lately. It was very advanced here. And this is documented when the Europeans get here. It's documented as a tented garden, north to south, east to west. I don't work for other people. I can't work for other people. I am a disabled war vet, and I live on my disability, and that's how I provide for myself. But I can't do the exchange of goods for service, or of money for services anymore. Like, I can't do that. And I can't put myself underneath the control of somebody else anymore, which is kind of what a job does. You pay somebody else who thinks that they own you, and I can't. Somebody pays you to own you for a specific period of time, and I can't. It just doesn't work for me anymore, especially not as a war vet who's been through some serious trauma, right? So I just don't work. I have a couple of degrees, and I use TikTok to teach, right? I don't care about the money. It's never been a big thing to me. Grew up dirt floor poor, and I have enough, right? I mean, don't always have enough, but I have enough, right? So it's not about the money. And I don't think that education should be gate kept behind $40,000 a year paywalls. I don't think that it should be gate kept behind, language that's hard for even those of us with extensive degrees to understand. And so sustainable living. Unfortunately, for the last 7 years, I've had to live in a city due to custody, due to a child custody case where I have an ex who was very controlling and was able to get custody. And so for me to be able to be near enough my kids to keep them safe, I've had to live in the city. And now that I have my child back, the youngest of my children who's still a child, I want to make sure that he goes through high school in the same place that he started, high school, so that he's not having that move, because I moved a lot as a child. And so I'm waiting another year, and then I'll be back out off of the city. I don't know exactly how it's going to look yet. We have a few different ideas. Most of them involve either land or living in a camper and traveling a little bit, right? But I do. Yeah. And that's really what it is I'm just locked for right now. And I know how to, be where I need to be when I need to be there. And until then, I'll just do this, So I don't, and for me, sustainable living is more about, I believe in honorable harvest. I was raised with honorable harvest. That's the way I was taught from my first memories, was honorable harvest. And so for me, sustainable living doesn't look like going out into a space and forcing it into something, right? Like farming and things like that. It's more about finding a space where I can find all my needs there, right? And helping it grow into a better space, right? And so to me, sustainable living, I think, looks a little bit differently than it looks to other people too, right? And I also, I did a semester in college where I had to take a philosophy course, and the philosophy course was an ethics course. And I also chose that semester to take an indigenous gardening course, because the college that I got my anthropology degree at it's a very heavily indigenous college. There's a lot of indigenous input and a huge indigenous studies department and stuff like that. And so it's a very indigenous heavy population where I'm at currently too. And so I did an indigenous gardening course because, well, I was raised with herbology. I still like, it's not one of those things that I retain very well. And so like, I was like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do this. And maybe I'll pick up a couple things that I've lost or a couple of new things. Right. And she gave us Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweet Grass, which is one of the recommended books. I don't have a lot, but one of the recommended books on the website. And that kept me sane through the philosophy course, where the person focused on ethics as to whether or not there was a God and whether or not ethics were based on God. And I was like, I want to throw your papers across the room every single time I read them. I want to scream. I literally spent the last 2 weeks of the course like, I won't even talk in here because you haven't introduced anybody who is not Western thought process and based in the Bible. Like, you have not introduced anybody into the concept that is not based in this. And you're going to give us our final test and then give us the Indian person who is talking about, Indians. I don't even think it was Hinduism. I think it was something else, like something different. Like, it was like, you're going to give us the final and then you're going to give us everybody else's idea. Like, what? Like, I'm not going to do that. We're not playing that game, And so the only way I got through was by reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And while I always take a lot of stuff from any course I take, I also, like that course on indigenous gardening, there was a lot of stuff that I knew, and I took more community out of the course than anything else. So when it comes to, I do know, and I do firmly understand that our concepts today of permaculture are really just honorable harvest, indigenous tending and governance being rewritten and whitewashed, right? And so I do, when I think of sustainable living, I think of a lot of whitewashed living, honestly. So I wouldn't say sustainable living for myself personally. Not that I don't think that we should all practice it any way we can find it, right? I just, for me, it doesn't track as the way I want it to. So I'm not on here every day. I can't be. I'd be insane. It's just not my thing. Yeah, it's well, and it wasn't her course. She teaches something completely differently. She teaches ethnobiology. Like, she's like brilliant. She's the foremost expert in the globe on moss. Robin Wall Kimmerer is the foremost expert on mosses in the entire planet. She's just, her understanding of the biome is just beyond, right? It's just beyond, right? Thank you, Adam. That's really true. A lot of concepts really get whitewashed, and the whitewashing loses the communal aspect. Like, communism is one of those things that got whitewashed, and it lost the communal aspect when it got whitewashed, right? Even though it's communalism, right? Communism, what we know of today as communism, is still so based in exploitation, right? It's still based in capitalism, and because it's still so based in capitalism and the idea of the ownership of property, that's why communism itself didn't work. Whereas communal-based living absolutely works, right? Because communal-based living doesn't believe in like ownership of the land itself. There's not a massive overhead owner who owns everything that you have to pay to, right? True communal concept, true communal thought processes, everybody has a say equally, right? Everybody works together equally. Everybody is fed. This is what was found when Europeans arrived here in many cases, right? Not in every case, because no people are monolithic, right? Yet in many cases, what we have documented as being found is the communal living of a people, or of groups of people who didn't have orphans, because if your biological parents were gone, you still belonged to the nation, right? Where the elders didn't starve because the elders were taken care of, right? Because they still had purpose. They still had, and they were still needed. They were still cared for. They were still a part of the community, right? Western culture. So let's go ahead and do that one really quick, because it's on here and it covers like half of this. So Western culture, what I call Western-based monocrop agriculture, which puts us into Western-based agriculture cities, right? This starts around 10,000 years ago. We start to see monocrop agriculture starting before that, but when it first starts, what we see is that it starts along the Nile. And if you do not know, the Nile flooded every year before it was dammed. And when it floods every year, it replaces the nutrients in the soil along the Nile every year. So there's not a lot of stuff along the Nile anyways. So you've got to plant and replant every year anyways. And there's always fertility to the soil, right? And when we're looking at that, what we're seeing is the Western-based agriculture, or the monocrop agriculture starting along the Nile with wheat and with barley along the Nile works there. They start moving it out into like the Fertile Crescent and across the Arabian Peninsula and the spaces that are more green. But they're moving it out in small communities. You might have, one space where you guys have half an acre that you guys have planted in barley because that's what you use for your beer. But you're still out hunting every day and you're still out gathering every day, right? Now, hunting and gathering collecting are two ways of getting nutrients from the environment without monocrop farming hunter-gathering and collecting are two ways to get from the environment without agriculture itself, because it's not it is tending the environment in many different ways, depending on the hunter-gatherer culture or collecting culture, yet it is not, doesn't work very hard on guiding the environment, whereas in agriculture is about guiding, right? Or about interacting with in a way to maneuver it somewhere, right? So when it starts in its first spaces along the Fertile Crescent, along outside of the Nile area, we're seeing that it's not the main form of sustenance. It's mainly to make your beer, right? It's not how you're living, really. You're living on other ways. We start to see that, it gets a little bit more where people are actually, farming, and that's the way they're subsisting. And people are starting to gather together a little bit, and they get into slightly larger villages. And then we start to see a gathering under a singular leader. Now, this gathering under a singular leader creating cities, right? Creating larger structures where you have a city that is based usually inside walls. Though early on, the walls might be, not in the first 10, 15 years, right? So you're starting to see cities based on gathering together all of these people and everybody farming. But at this point, what you're getting is cities that are they're basing their farming as a tithe, right? So you get the ownership of the area by either the, maybe if you're a farmer, you actually own your land, if you're lucky, right? And you're just paying a tithe to the king in charge, or you see that the king owns all the land around you, and then you're paying for the usage of the land, basically. So what we start to see is in the archaeological record, what we see is how these cities start on a physiological standing and what these things lead to. What we don't see is the mentality of the starting until you put together quite a few things. So at 10,000 years ago, we also see this extreme rise in violence, spike in violence. Prior to 10 to 12,000 years ago, we have roughly 2,000 individuals in the archaeological record. And of those 2,000 individuals in the archaeological record, only roughly 2% of them have injuries that could possibly be attributed to violence. Now, what do I mean by possibly be attributed to violence? If I see a skull where a stone has hit that skull, I cannot tell you from this standpoint and time frame whether or not that was a stone in somebody's hand or a stone that came off the ceiling of a cave, or they fell and hit their head on a stone, right? I can't tell you that this was an act of violence from another human being, right? I can't tell you that this is violent. I can tell you that they died probably from having their brain caved in by a stone, but I can't tell you how the stone caved their brain in. So we have roughly 2% of things that can possibly be attributed to violence. At 10,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows us going from roughly 2% of 2,000 individuals to 18 to 20%. And we also see a rise in skeletons, like we also see a rise in individuals that we're seeing in the record. We also see that this 18 to 20% is no longer could possibly be attributed to. It becomes definitive. And when we see this, what I mean is in 10,000 years ago in Kenya, there is a massacre that is 8 people lined up. One of them is heavily pregnant. They're all sitting cross-legged on the ground, and their arms are all bound in their laps. The pregnant woman's hands are bound underneath her waist, okay, and or underneath her belly, and they're all hit in the back of the skull from behind. This is very obviously intentional violence. So at 10,000 years ago, we see things go from possibly being attributed to at 2% to absolutely without a doubt violent at 18 to 20%, right? And so when we're looking at this, at the same time, we're seeing people start to have monocrop agriculture based cities and towns. At this time, what we're seeing is a gathering of people together. And this gathering of people together initially is the barbarians in the hills are coming to steal your grain, right? Now, this is stuff that we start to get out of the archaeological record and into the historical record, our earliest writings, right? Our earliest stories, right? Our oldest author is female, if you did not know, right? So in our earliest stories of the region, we see things like the Tale of Sargon. And the Tale of Sargon, like any stories written down after the starting of writing in a specific area, these stories are coming from a few thousand years before, a few hundred years before. They travel down through oral tradition, which is generally actually more valuable and more factual than written tradition or history, written story, right? So we see oral traditions, which are very factual, being translated into written stories. And in the Tale of Sargon, what we see is a child who was put in a basket in a river and floated down the river, pulled out by a gardener or a sustenance farmer, depending on the story. And he decided, depending on the story, that he was the child of a river goddess or a child of a king. This king is something I see in some of the later translations. The translation that I have that I can't pull up, the king's something I see on Google. The translation that I have that I can't pull up to read you word for word right now, because again, the box is in storage, actually states a river goddess, right? And so he believes that he's the child of a god, child of a deity, and he's pulled out, and this, you'll love the rest of this one. He's pulled out by a sustenance farmer or a gardener. And when he's pulled out and he's living with this sustenance farmer or this gardener, he is not getting, like sustenance farming is hard labor, and sustenance farming is starving usually. Most sustenance farmers even now have to take loans out every year to do their farming, right? And that's in big farms, right? So like farming is not good for you. It's not good for the environment. Hunter-gatherer collector lifestyles. I froze again. Let's try it one more time. I froze again. Let's try it one more time. I froze again. Let it go, because I'm freezing. I'm freezing. I'm freezing. Every time I turn around, I'm getting frozen. Okay, so sustenance farming is a very hard life. Right? You're up before dawn. You go to bed after the lights, after the sun's gone down. And it's grueling work all day, every day. And half of it, you're hungry. Whereas hunting and gathering is not. Today, hunter-gatherers, studies done on hunter-gatherers who are still around today show that 16 hours a week is what their overworkers work. Most of the members of a community will put in 8 hours a week to sustain the community's nutrient level, clothing level, housing level. Most members of the community will only have to, and that's like the main, like there are people who put in less. And then again, you have like your overworkers at 16 hours a week, right? So the sustenance farming as opposed to hunter gathering or collecting, is extremely hard work. It's extremely grueling, and you're without most of the time. So Sargon reaches an age of maturity and decides that he's going to take over and create a city. He's going to gather all the people around and create this city. And in doing this, I kind of look at it as kind of the mafia, like kind of old mob boss mentality. He grabs his people that he's decided and convinced that, he's the child of a god and therefore as a deity should be worshipped. And he takes them around with him and convinces people to hire me to protect you from the barbarians in the hills. And so this is your earliest starting of cities through the historical concept. To me, this is narcissism. To me, the childhood that you see him go through is a childhood that has been known to create narcissism. Narcissism or the dark triad personality disorders have a tendency to be created from childhoods with abandonment and then lack of sustenance, like lack of nutrient, a hard scrabble life, a lack of, right? And so narcissism and narcissism tends to be somebody thinking that they are the child of a god. I mean, I've married one. He thought he was going to die and be reborn. Like, narcissists tend to think that they are some way special, and being the child of a god is definitely special, right? And narcissists have a tendency to gather people around them to do their dirty work for them. And they use that dirty work, they call it flying monkeys. They send out their flying monkeys to get everybody to do what they want them to do, right? So having your friends going around helping you convince everybody else that, they need to pay you, right? This is very much early mob mentality, mob boss mentality, right? And so when we see this rise of violence associated with this. The earliest archaeological reference that we have for a city is Ain Ghazal along a river in Jordan. It's about 9,000 years old. Now, Ain Ghazal has been rebuilt. Ain Ghazal is there today, but the original Ain Ghazal only lasted for 300 years. And the original Ain Ghazal only lasted for 300 years because what they did was they took a fertile river valley and they ripped everything out and replaced it with their monocrop agriculture. And within 300 years, the ripping of all the nutrients out of the soil and replacing it with something that needed nutrients meant that all the soil in the valley was leached of its nutrients. And the city is like in the valley against a hill, right? And so up in the hill is where they're taking their animals and they stripped the entire area. Between the stripping it for the agriculture and stripping it for the animals, they caused climate destruction, took a fertile valley to a wasteland in 300 years, in the first monocrop agriculture city that we have. Now you tie this in with the concept of Sargon, right? And these early, what we call god kings, and I call narcissistic god kings. When you tie these two together, you're seeing this building of ownership of land. You're seeing this building of ownership of land translating into ownership of people. And when you see I'm protecting you from the barbarians in the hills, you start to see the rise of what we call othering today. This used to be called Orientalism. This is not a good word. This Oriental itself is not a positive word. This is why we do not use it anymore. I am only telling you this right now because I want you to understand that othering used to be referred to as this. And it is basically the idea that you should hate your neighbor because your neighbor is the one that's out to get you because they look different from you, or because they come from a different culture than you, or because they come from a different space than you. So therefore, they're the person that you should be watching for while the government comes in and steals everything you have. It's this sleight of hand. So if I can convince you that you have to pay me so I can pay my soldiers to prevent you from being attacked by the barbarians in the hills, then I can convince you to let me steal from you. I can convince you to spend your entire life in a very hard scrabble environment where you are hurting from sun up to sundown, while I live in the lap of luxury, hoarding the goods that you create, right? So when we see we see that these three things are all coinciding. This rise of violence in the archaeological record, the usage of monocrop agriculture in areas that it doesn't exist, and the climate destruction that it causes, and the rise of hierarchy dependent on ownership of anything, property, each other, animals. I can own this. It belongs to me. When we start thinking we can own property, we start thinking that everything can be property, right? So, these three tying together at this time depends on othering. Now, othering has gone from the barbarians in the hills are going to steal your crops, and so you have to pay me your crops so that they don't steal them from you, and I'll dole them back out to you at a right basis if I have enough. Then So we see the way that they maintain that control. No, it's mostly desert because of climate cycling. So the globe goes through climate cycling, right? The green swath that we see across Africa moves depending on the millennia, right? Like it's actually like a wind, not a wind, atmospheric strip across the globe, right? And it moves, right? So you'll see, and you'll see that strip of green actually will move up and down, right? And has over the course of millennia. The different parts of, like, the Mediterranean used to be a savanna. The Mediterranean at 7,000 years ago was all dry and it was all a savanna. So, or 7 million years ago, not 7,000 years ago. When we're looking at this, what we're seeing is this is the cycle of climate, right? The polar ice caps melt regularly and then they freeze again regularly. We have ice ages regularly. We have warmer interglacial periods regularly. Now, there's a difference between the typical climate cycling that happens for the sake of the planet, for the health of the planet, and climate destruction. The destruction that we see, so Ain Ghazal, it's there again, right? Like, so it came back, like after 300 years, they had destroyed it and they were gone for, I think it's like 1,000 years. And then they came back. And Ain Ghazal is actually like one of the cities that Sargon, I think is a city that Sargon is attributed to a few thousand years after its earliest start, right? So when we look at it, it rises and it falls and it rises and it falls, right? And it didn't first start with Sargon. I'm relating the historical document as not a possibility. This is the record of what happens with this king. He's the earliest king that we have, right? And I'm relating this record to how it would have probably happened here as well, right? It's absolutely what happened with him, but you can see with the things like othering and the things like like the way that violence is intershifting is coming along with those as well. Jetstream, thank you, Jedi. So it's not necessarily it's the destruction. It's just the fact that the globe changes, and those will be green again, right? It might not be within our lifetimes, but they'll be green again, right? As long as we don't. Well, and see, here's the thing: we're not destroying the planet; we're destroying our livability on the planet. It's not that the planet's going anywhere; it's that we're not going to be able to live on it anymore, right? That's what climate destruction does. It's not that the planet itself is not going to be here for another zillion fucking years. It's that sapiens won't be here for another zillion years, right? And that we will be the species that caused it ourselves. Of all the species across the entire history of time, we will be the species that caused it ourselves. Like everybody else, they go extinct because, that's just how things happen. We cause it because that egotism, right? Because we know we're the best. We're the best, we're the best, we're the best, we're the best. This is how we can prove that we're the best, right? Othering, though, let's talk about that because this is really important to today, right? So we see that this is how this othering starts. This othering translates down, and how this translates down, we see it today. First, it goes from the barbarians in the hills are coming to steal your grain, so you have to pay me. To that other city, they want us, our resources, and so they're going to come and attack us, or they think that we're better than them, so they're going to come and attack us. They're barbarians, right? And then we see, so that's nationalism, which we still have today, right? So we see it go from the barbarians in the hills into nationalism, that other nation, that other city. After nationalism, we start to see it within our own communities when we start to see gender-based othering, and we start to see this in the ancient Greeks. And when we start to see gender-based othering in the ancient Greeks, it's not because they believe in two genders, because they don't. It is because they want to keep women weak, because they don't like women. They prefer their third gender, which is preteen boys. When we see that this translates from that, we go next into religion. We start to see religion-based othering when we start to see the rise of monotheism. In the rise of monotheism, we start to see this idea that if you're not following my God, then obviously you're of the devil, and so you must be wrong, and so I must kill you. And once we get through othering based on religion takes us into othering based on skin color, because religion itself takes us into religion. The Bible gives justification to white supremacists in their mind, right? In their concept. That's the justification that they had before they create the theory of race, is from the Bible and the Bible's view on Mark of Haim, I think it is. So after we take it from othering based on religion, we start to take it to othering based on skin color, which we define as race. After we take it to othering based on skin color, which we define as race, today we start to use things like immigration, and we start to use housing or houselessness as a method of othering. So today you're being told to hate the people who don't even have a roof over their head, not the government that's forcing them to live on the street. Today you're being told that it is the immigrant that is trying to steal your job, not the fact that nobody will pay you enough to work, so it takes somebody who's willing to accept that low ass pay to work that job, right? So today we have othering that, and it's not that it's moved beyond all of that, right? It's not that it stopped using all of those. It's that it's including more things. We still other based on our concept of who the barbarians in the hills are. If you ain't never heard a joke about Appalachians or hillbillies, then so we still other based on our concept of what barbarians in the hills are. We still other based on our concept of nationalism. That's really a lot of what the immigration othering is. And it is also like when we look at, well, that's a country that's non-industrial, or that's a country that really needs our help because we're so much better than them and they can't eat. Or that country is ran by an icky dictator, so obviously everybody in that country is evil, right? So we're still othering based on nationalism. We other based on gender more than we ever have in our past. Not only do we other based on biological sex, but we also other based on your own concept of identity, because that is what gender is. It is your own concept of your self-identification, what you feel, what you think of, like how you think, how you interact with the world. That's what gender is. It's your own concept of how you interact with the world. So not only you other based on biological sex today, but we other based on your ability to think for yourself of what your own gender might be, right? And we also, of course, other based on race. We have entire societies like the United States that is built on structural racism to keep people in check. We've been talking about medical racism and other things along through this. And all of those things are part of that othering based on racial structure, right? Based on our ideas of a now debunked theory that is really just to justify atrocity again, right? And we absolutely other on religion today. I mean, some religions other themselves, but we absolutely other based on religion today. We absolutely other, I mean, there are people who hate on witches still. Like there is still the idea of burning witches out there, right? Like there's still a lot of othering based on religion. And then we absolutely see that with all of those otherings that have carried on through 10,000 years, we absolutely continue and pile them together. And we include today othering based on whether or not you're escaping a brutal dictatorship and fleeing to our country, which we've told you you should, or whether or not we've exploited every last dime out of you that we possibly can. And now you don't even have a space to stay, right? The right to life absolutely 100% should include the right to all the basic necessities of life. The basic necessities of life is home. Home. Right? If you do not have a place to sleep, to shelter you from, every animal on this planet has the right to a place to sleep and be sheltered, except for Homo sapiens. So the right to life absolutely should include home, and it should absolutely include food, and it should absolutely include water. These are necessities, basic, bare necessities to live, right? So with all of those things, we need to look at the fact that this othering, like we were looking at earlier, somebody coming in here, and I mean, please uplift yourself and uplift your people. Absolutely. If you have been in a space that is marginalized, and I do it all the time. Like I want to all the time. We still must not go, I'm the only one that has this and nobody else can, right? Or rather, Nebula is the agency that I work with that keeps us safe. Actually, Nebula is one of those things. Well, Nebula themselves, I believe, is like the head of the agency, but they're a part of the agency that actually keeps us alive on here and doesn't take us off. So they are 100% everything. They get all of it, and that's totally understandable. But they are 100%. I mean, just so anybody knows, right? But when we're looking at the way that this all coalesces, what we need to understand is that as long as we're looking for reasons that I'm better than you or you're better than me, instead of understanding that we're all in the same boat. Don't get me wrong. Some of us are in a little bit leakier side of the boat. Or for some of us, there's sharks trying to jump in the boat and hit us, right? Do not get me wrong. I am not saying that we are all dealing with the same traumas. I am saying that we are all in a sinking ship and we have a choice. We can either battle each other over who gets the sinking ship, or we can unite and work together and go take back the big ship over there that's abandoned us, right? So we, instead of looking at each other and going, you're the reason to hate, you're the reason I have problems, you're the problem, we need to go, no, yo neighbor, you're not the problem. That's the problem. And we need to take care of that. We need to take care of that which maintains the structural hierarchy, which maintains the power that keeps us from living in a healthy space. I am going to go ahead and take off because I try and keep these just down to 2 hours for my own mental health these days. But before I go, I always have something I like to say, so stick around. Don't leave yet. We didn't really go into the biology yet, or today, of who we are biologically. It is important to note, though, that biologically we are nurturing and communal, right? Biologically, we need to have nurture and we need to have community. This is evidenced in the fact that we have mandatory midwifery, which means we must have somebody assist us to give birth. Therefore, we must have community to even give birth to our children. And this is evidenced in the fact that we have 5 life stages, from brain development stages from neonate to adult. And in those 5 brain development stages from neonate to adult, we must have extensive nurture from multiple people to be able to fully develop our brain to its full capacity, to its full understanding. Without having nurture, We did studies in the 50s that proved what we call failure to thrive. And this is, they put orphans in one room and in another room. And in one room, they didn't touch them at all. They just propped up their bottles and changed their diapers. And in the other room, they gave them love and they gave them care. And in the room where they gave them no nurture, they died. It's called failure to thrive. You can have all your physical needs met. If you do not get the need of nurture met, you are not going to live. So we have a need for nurture and a need for community at a biological level. And today we live in a world that tells us taking care of each other, being members of community, nurturing each other is bad. If it doesn't tell us that only certain people have to do it, it's telling us that it's bad for everybody to do. And it does it in these really gaslighty ways where it convinces you that love is hate and hate is love. And it convinces you that you shouldn't help people or feed people or take care of other people because they haven't worked hard enough for it to deserve to be alive. They haven't worked hard enough to deserve to be alive, right? As we force everybody to give birth, right? So we live in a community and in a time, or not even a community, we live in a space and in a time where the idea of community and the idea of nurture has been removed or gaslit to such a heavy extent that most of us are very isolated and most of us do not get any nurturing and do not have any community. Depression and anxiety are natural, healthy reactions to an unhealthy society. Feeling that there is a problem is a natural, healthy reaction to a problem, and we live in a problem. We must give ourselves compassion and understanding. If you know that there is a problem, but you believe that you're the problem, this is a healthy response because you can't figure out where it is. Many of us just can't function anymore, right? I want you to know today that these are all very healthy responses to an unhealthy world, to an unhealthy society, to an unhealthy space. That you've been gaslit and lied to, and everybody else around you has as well. And that the base biological needs that we have been ignored for the vast majority of us. Your feelings are valid. Know today that you deserve love. I don't mean that you deserve somebody to get freaky with you. I mean that you deserve love, the basic, essential of who we are, compassion and empathy and love, right? You deserve to be loved. You deserve to love yourself. And just by breathing, you are worthy. We like to think that our worth is based on how much can be exploited out of us. But your worth is not based on what somebody can exploit from you. Every single one of us are worthy of housing and food by breathing. Every one of us are worthy of the essentials of life from the first breath we draw just by breathing. And those essentials for life include nurture and community. So you are worthy of love just by breathing, just by existing. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be anybody. You don't have to try so hard. You are worthy just by breathing. And those of us who are aware that there are a problem are the only people out there that can change it, because you can't change what you aren't even aware of. So in my mind, if you are feeling like there's a problem, you're worth a little bit more, because it means that you're essential to the change of that problem. You're essential to the change that we need to get back to a space of nurture and community, to get back to a space of interaction on a healthy level, right? So please remember today, if you're in a space where you feel that well, first of all, there are very many times in my life that I thought that nobody loved me and nobody cared. And I was wrong. When I look back, when people talk to me about things, when I look at them differently, I realize that there were a lot of people around me who loved me and cared about me, and I just could not see it because of my own sense of self-worth and my own lack of sense of self-worth, right? Or just because I didn't understand. So I want you to understand that, well, you probably feel today like there's not a lot of people or maybe nobody who loves you, that there are definitely people out there that love you. And if they're not people in your street and in your real life, please know and understand that I do. I love you just because you're a human being alive. I love you just because you're a part of my community. We are all a part of a singular, broad community, and you're a part of my community, and I need you in that community because every member of that community is important. So if you don't feel like there's anybody out there that loves you today, I first want you to know that there are absolutely people out there that love you today, whether it feels like it or not, and that I absolutely love you. Okay, because you are part of this big floating ball of pink energy in my mind that we all are, and we all are in, we're all the same floating energy. We need to take care of each other. And the other thing I want to tell you is that you should give yourself grace today. Give yourself love today. Give yourself compassion today because you deserve it. And especially so many of us who do not get any of it, you deserve love and compassion. So give it to yourself if you are not getting it from any other quarter, right? And then the last thing that I wanted to remind you all is that the solution for all of this, the way we get back to who we were, the way that we ditch all this bullshit, is land back on a global scale. Land back on a global scale returns tending and governance to Indigenous people on a global scale. And the returning of tending and governance on a global scale to Indigenous people reverses climate destruction, teaches us how to live in communion with the biome or the planet again as one organism interacting, and gives us back community, because Indigenous animism, which is what Indigenous people on a global scale belong to, is an animistic thought process. Animism is communal. Animism is about taking care of every part of the biome, not just the land and the animals, but about all the human beings within the biome as well. Not just the human beings, but all the land and the animals within the biome as well. So land back on a global scale, returning tending and governance to Indigenous people on a global scale, not only reverses climate destruction by returning us to tending and an understanding within the biome that is healthier for the biome and healthier for us, but it also gives us back community. It also gives us back nurturing, and it gives us back the care that we need every single day. Thank you so much, Dee. Much love to everybody. Take care of yourself today. Make sure you give yourself love. I've had a week of traveling, so it's been a little bit rough for me, but I will try and be on at least a couple of times this coming week and try and be on next week as well. So it might be a couple days just so that I can relax, but I will try and be on at least by midweek. So much love, everybody. Take so much care. Love yourselves, love each other, right? Like that's what we need, and take care of yourself because you absolutely deserve it. Thank you so much, Skims. Have a great day, everybody. Take care. Much love, you too. It's so good to see you. Take care.